phone maker companies. Why does predictive text still suck? I know it's tough to predict what I want to say. I don't even know what I want to say most of the time. But when I write a word like 500 times, that's probably a word to me. Keep it in your dictionary. Like if I write shut up the first time, you're like, well, I don't know what that is, underlined with red. Thank you, appreciate it. But if I write shut up over and over and over again, you don't need to try to predict that. This is what my phone predicts shut up to. Agassi. Who says Agassi ever? Andre Agassi and his friends. That's not enough people to warrant a worldwide prediction of Agassi. He should suck it up and spell his last name out like everyone else. No one's even talked about Andre Agassi since before predictive text was created. I need some calming chamomile. It's not working. At least shut up isn't a real word and it wants to predict it to something that's real. That's fine. But when I write so, my phone predicts do. When I write go, it predicts to. Why would you predict that my correctly spelled word is wrong? So if I want to say, I want to go to Togo's, it says, I want to to. God dang it! And when I write says, it predicts I wanted to say days. Who set that up? If someone writes says, they probably want to say days. Who says anyway? I just did. When I write a word and it does predict what I wanted to say, but I accidentally hit the X, the phone forgets the word that it's known since it was born and learns my typo. Now, when I write psycho, it predicts Payco, and it still underlines it red. It knows it's making me sound like an idiot, and you only call someone a psycho when you're having a serious altercation. Oh my god, you think it's spelled Payco? I'm glad we broke up, stupid. It was predictive text! And I predict you're an idiot. Yeah, well, I predict that you spelled your Y-O-U-R just then in your head. Yeah, so? What is that wrong? That's wrong? Yeah. Oh no. It's like the phone is your awesome friends from school who won't let you forget that one time you threw up in their mom's car while she was driving you home. Toby, remember that one time you wrote Payco instead of Psycho? Just let me blow out my birthday candles. Yeah, whatever, Payco. Why don't you go Payco on your Paycos. High five off to the side. If I write all caps, ha 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 ha, I don't want my phone to predict every time I write ha ha. I want to laugh like a freaking Payco. There's just too many buttons. I want the 9-button keypad as an option with the T9 predictive text because there's only 9 buttons. When there's 12 times as many buttons, I'm 12 times as less likely to be able to hit them accurately while navigating traffic. Which I don't do. Listen, I know phones can do awesome stuff. Predictive text is pretty good. Without it, none of the words I write would make any sense. But just get rid of the stupid stuff. Please. If you have a similar situation, post in the comments.
Welcome to Darkwood Brew, where you've just left the stupid stuff zone and entered a realm somewhere between the ridiculous and the sublime. I'm Eric Elness, your host, and Darkwood Brew is that place where ancient Christian mystical practice is blended with modern interactive web technology, world-class jazz, arts, biblical scholarship, and, well, you never know exactly what's going to happen. Once upon a time, there was a great nation, and that nation has gone through an amazing period of an economic boom that had lasted so long that people predicted that perhaps there would never be a bust. It would just keep on going. During that boom, the rich got, well, richer. But so did the middle class. The middle class experienced levels of economic prosperity that their grandparents could only dream of. Those folks bulldozed their bungalows that had been in their families for generations and built mansions, or at least houses that their grandparents would have considered mansions. They ate the finest foods, they drank rare wines, they adorned their houses with fine art, and they hired housekeepers to clean those houses. Only problem? While many experienced amazing economic prosperity, the rich getting richer and the middle class even entering the rich class, the poor got poorer. I'm speaking, of course, of 8th century Israel in the 8th century BCE. The message of the prophet Amos will be our focus during this 6-part series, which will also be joined by guest Frank Schaeffer. And what we're going to be finding is the message of Amos is surprisingly fresh today, encountering very similar issues that we find in our own society and offering a depth of wisdom and insight if we will get beneath the text and explore the historical context that, well, make punditry concerning the issues between rich and poor these days seem, well, like they were written with predictive text sometimes. So I hope you can join us for this whole series. And for this whole series, we will be joined, as I mentioned, by Frank Schaeffer, the author of Crazy for God and about, a dozen other books. Frank has experience both with Christianity on the far right and has come full circle to join us tonight with some surprising insights about religion and its role, the relationship between church and state and society. So before we go any further, let's let the band take us into Darkwood Brew.
So we finished up 4 on Earth.
Yeah, that was
but it's still going, I hear.
Fun series, yeah. And during that series, we were kind of helping the United Church of Christ out during their campaign to raise a lot of awareness about the Earth and take care of the Earth and write some letters, plant some trees. And last week they hadn't tabulated all their figures yet, but we have a more recent tabulation. So we promised you that we would give you an update here. Let's see what we've got here. They didn't quite make any of their goals really, but nevertheless, even though they had a million hours of Earth care they were looking for, they 500,000 ain't too bad.
That's really good.
Yeah, 93,000 trees and almost 48,000 advocacy letters written. To me, that's actually the most impressive figure of all. It takes quite a lot of gumption to go out and write an advocacy letter or a letter to the editor, and a lot of people apparently did
Just
that.
empowering people to know that they can do that is really good. So if this isn't the issue that really struck you to get going on something like that, knowing that you can do that in the future for an issue that you do have a passion about is wonderful.
Yeah, and of course the 50 days are over for that campaign, but the Earth is still around.
Yeah,
and so
we still need to care.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the campaign continues, so to speak.
Yeah. I was really impressed with the trees. They really, literally just popped up all over because they were less than half, I think, on that figure the week before. But I went on vacation and everybody planted trees.
That's right. Well, I know at Countryside Church here in Omaha, we were giving away to teachers. We were selling them for Mother's Day and so forth. Yeah, so we have a whole forest in my backyard now.
Do you?
So, yeah.
We only did a couple of mine, but yeah, we have them.
Yeah.
It's nice.
Pretty cool, yeah. Well, joining us for this series, we have a lot of our regular Darkwood Brew bloggers that you've come to know and love. They're writing throughout the week as we go into the episodes. Everybody is with us from before, and we've added on the far left Margaret McGrath as well. And
nice.
Margaret has kind of blogged off and on for us, but we've got Margaret, we've got Leslie Mural, who's also going to the Wild Goose Festival with us this summer. And Cynthia Astle, Scott Frederickson, there's me popping my head out there, Marianne Folkert, and Ian Lynch. So quite an array of bloggers, and boy, they've got some good stuff they keep.
A lot of good voices there.
Absolutely. If you would like to help keep Darkwood Brew on the air, we also encourage you and also thank you for donating too. We are still under a matching grant, and so every dollar that is pledged, whether that be a single dollar amount or a weekly or monthly amount, all that is doubled right now. So thank you for sending in your donations, and we appreciate their continuing.
Mm-hmm. So what's this whole series? It's Amos. What do we know about Amos?
Well, Amos is a pretty obscure guy in many respects. Like I say, it's kind of I was telling people beforehand, Amos is kind of like a flyover book in many respects. It's very short, and he's really grumpy. Because
He'll fit right in.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes you just kind of read him, and just your hair stands up on your back of your neck or something. But if you understand the historical context from which he comes, and also get underneath the English into the Hebrew, start dabbling around, actually, Amos has quite a sense of humor, even though he's very sarcastic and grumpy as well. Yeah. But in the 8th century, he was. The Bible identifies him as a shepherd. He came from the town of Tekoa, which is about 10 miles from Jerusalem in southern Israel. And many people believe that because he was a shepherd, and also because he has some issues with the rich getting richer while the poor are getting poorer, that he was a poor person himself. Shepherds in Israel were almost universally poor. But curiously, here's the first instance where getting underneath the English is helpful. The word that we translate as shepherd here is actually not the usual one that the Old Testament uses. This particular word, nokade, only appears twice in the Old Testament. Once applied to Amos, and once applied to King Mesha of Moab, who was at one point a vassal to the king of Israel and had to supply the king of Israel with 100,000 sheep and 100,000 rams.
That's a serious shepherd.
Yeah, so as one person long ago observed, calling Amos a shepherd is a bit like calling Jimmy Carter a peanut farmer.
Oh, I see. Exactly.
Probably actually a person of great wealth, whose friends were likely wealthy, and also
probably own this sheep, right?
Yeah, and probably in a better position than most people, including the poor, to see how the system could be rigged against them, and is rather upset about that. So he
does get grumpy.
Yeah, and of course that system in Israel's day was significantly actually like our own in the sense that Israel. Well, if you set up Israel geographically, and we'll just pull up a map here. There's actually my hand drawing from a few years ago of Israel, but if you look to the north of Israel, you would see the Mesopotamians, where modern day Iraq is, and so forth, Syria, and to the south you'd have, and that was a kind of a superpower. That would be the Assyrians or the Babylonians, depending on the time frame. In the south there was Egypt, and these two countries were a bit like the United States and Russia, or not necessarily always friends with each other, and oftentimes, actually, those folks were at war with each other, and Israel was a land bridge between those two. If you look to the left, there's the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and to the right was impassable desert. So if those two superpowers wanted to get at each other, they had to conquer Israel first, which is why Israel spent most of its time poor and conquered. However, when there was peace between those nations, usually not because they liked each other, but because they were too weak for internal reasons to attack each other, they started trading with each other. And when the trade moved through Israel, imagine we're sitting here in Nebraska. Israel's half the size of Nebraska. If you can imagine the United States on one side and Russia, or let's say China, they're a trading partner of ours,
right,
on the other side, and all the trade had to go through Nebraska. Well,
nice.
Imagine that if you could just dip your finger in the flow of the money, the goods and services and so forth. Perhaps you owned a portion of the trade route, so you could tax, pay toll, or you were supplying goods and services to the people on the trade route, or you were tossing in things to be traded yourself. You could make a lot of money.
Imagine opening a bar. That'd be good.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, absolutely. Then there were taverns and so forth along on the route. So a lot of people were becoming tremendously wealthy, far wealthier than their ancestors had ever been. However, if you didn't have access to that, dipping your finger in the flow, well, all you experienced was rising prices.
Oh.
And so literally the middle class, the rich, they were getting richer and getting phenomenally rich. But the poor, they were actually experiencing worse conditions than ever. And that's the kind of the historical geographical setting.
Not too far off.
We're going to find some surprising parallels to today. In fact, a lot more than you'd ever guess, and some very fresh solutions to those issues as well. Yeah.
So, as we take this, are we going to take this verse by verse and kind of do some background between some of this? Because I noticed when I read it the first time this morning, as I was reading through things, there were a whole bunch of references to things that I wouldn't have gotten had I not taken some time and to play with it. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is kind of a difficult book to interpret oftentimes, and so every week we'll have a chunk of scripture like we always do, that we'll do a reflective piece on, which we call Numa Divina, which is based on the ancient Lectio Divina. But in order to really get what's going on and really hear the text, we're going to need to find out a little bit more about the verses. Once you do, the text will start popping for you. But yeah, so we're going to just simply go through those texts right now, and I'll give you a little bit of background.
And we happen to have an Old Testament scholar here to
That's right.
to help us with that.
Yeah.
That's going to be great.
I did actually a lot of study of the Book of Amos during
Right.
my doctoral program at Princeton Seminary under Liang Xiao, who's been a Skype guest
Yeah,
here before.
that would be great.
Absolutely.
Resource.
So yeah, if we're going to look at for instance, the first, we're only going to go through 3 verses, but just a little portion of those verses. If you put that up on the screen, here you can see, just if you look at that, the very start of the passage, for thus says the Lord. Now, by the way, we're picking up in chapter 2. What Amos has done is he's started to, he's come up from the south to the north, and he's addressing people, probably in the public square, and he's ranting about all the nations around them, and saying, that they've committed all these basically war crimes, and he's really upset about that. And you can just imagine the crowd saying, yeah, right on, Amos. And then he finally gets around to Judah, which is in the south, who at this time was a rival with the northern Israel. The southern Israelites and the northern Israelites were split at that time. And he starts calling out Judah for their problems. They're like, well, it's a little close to home, but yeah, that's right. Oh, yeah. But then he says, now he turns to our passage. Sorry, let's put that up now. And he says, and he uses the same pattern for each of the nations. And now he says, for thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of, this case, Israel, but in all the other cases, just insert the nation, and for 4. Now that's maybe a little bit confusing. For 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4. That's an idiomatic expression in Hebrew. That's like saying, for more than enough reasons.
Oh.
Then I will not revoke the punishment. And then he goes on into what the problem is.
More than enough reason. That makes a lot more sense than 3 or 4.
Yeah.
I was wondering what the third one was.
Yeah, no, he's just
Good.
saying, you're pissing me off here, and I've got more than enough reason to be pissed off right now. And then he starts naming some of those reasons.
Okay.
So, yeah. In fact, if you put that slide back up, let's take a look at that first reason there. He says, oh, no, back up. Oh, yeah, no, sorry, you got it right. I'm sorry, my glasses.
Verse 7.
That's right. Verse 6 still. I will not revoke the punishment. Then because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals.
They couldn't get more than a pair of sandals for the needy.
That's right. Yeah, he's criticizing the rich for selling the poor for too low a price.
That's
it.
No, there's something else there, right?
Yeah, that seems kind of obscure. Yeah. Well, let's take that silver piece first. The selling the righteous for silver. If you look at in the Hebrew, that's actually again an idiomatic expression that doesn't come out clearly in the English. It's like saying you sell the righteous for the going rate, for the silver there. For technical reasons, which we won't go into, it signals that it's an idiomatic expression for the going rate. So you sell the righteous for the going rate, for the commonly accepted rate. Picture, for instance, the minimum wage, and picture a time when the minimum wage could have provided a sustainable level of wealth for a person to get by anyway, and then prices rise rapidly, but the minimum wage is still stuck back at where it was, a decade before prices rose, and people say, well, we're paying the going rate, what's the problem? Yeah. So that's the first criticism, and then there's the sandals thing. Amos is not criticizing the rich for selling the poor for too low a price. That is actually, the sandals were used to conduct legal transactions back in the day. If you sold a piece of property, for instance, and then the person who gave you the money for that property would take one of your sandals. And this is so that if there was ever a question about whether that person was the legal owner of the property, he could say, well, look, I've got a sandal, if the shoe fits, so to speak. See, we made a transaction here, this proves it. So you can imagine a poor person, they are working harder and harder, they're making just the usual rate, the going rate, which is no longer sustainable. They are, what do you do? Well, some turn to crime, but very few people turn to crime when they can't sustain their families. They just work harder, but if they're working harder and they still can't make it, what do? you start selling the family heirlooms, and whatever property you might own, you sell that. And so there's those sandals being traded. People saying, hey, this was all legal. We're fine.
Eventually you're barefoot, right?
Well, yeah, the poor are barefoot. Yeah. So those are just a couple of the things we encounter right off the bat in our passage this evening.
And then we talk about father and son going into the same girl.
Yeah, that's right. If you put that passage,
Profanity,
that next slide up on the screen there, there's so the next verse 7, they trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. That's fairly, we kind of know a little.
This all sounds pretty familiar. Actually.
Yeah, but the father and son going to the same girl probably is a reference to people who then sought to sell, try to make their ends meet. They were selling their bodies, like we see today, sex trafficking, so to speak, and father and son just going in and because they could, and
so no respect for the relationships.
Yeah, and just to give you an example of Amos's sarcasm, underneath the English there again, my holy name is profaned. There's actually sexual connotations in that word profane. So it's basically like father and son going to the same girl, and you've something to my name. Fill in the blank. Predictive text.
We have to watch what we say.
That's right.
But good.
So, yeah. Finally, as we move just to the last part of our passage, we find this another kind of obscure reference. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. And in the house of their God, they drink wine brought with fines they imposed. This garments taken in pledge, well, first of all, the Hebrew there probably laying themselves down beside every altar. It's probably they're stretching out garments beside every altar. But anyway, a garment taken in pledge is a special reference in Israel too. That's also a legal transaction. If you were a day laborer and you didn't have enough money to feed your family before you left home, you basically went to the ancient equivalent of payday loans. You found somebody who would loan you the money. You'd say, hey, I promise I could pay you back when I'm paid at the end of the day. But the creditor, how would the creditor know that that he'd be paid back? Well, the day laborer would give offer his garment, because the garment would be solid assurance that the person would be paid back, because the garment was really the primary way the person kept warm at night. And so they traded that, and so the person knew, okay, I'm probably going to get my money. But what happens if the day laborer gets sick, or a member of the family gets sick and has to go home and he's not paid, or not paid enough? Well, people are keeping the garments then, and they're feeling so morally right about that hey, I didn't get paid, so they would even metaphorically stretch them before the altar in the very temple of God, saying, So basically, what we have is three situations here. People, not the wealthy trying to devise schemes to take money from the poor illegally or anything like that. This is actually the poor getting poorer, and everything is happening perfectly legally. They're being...
So everyone's justified.
Being hired for the going rate, yeah. Everybody's feeling justified, yeah. And the legal transactions are being made. And yet the poor just kind of keep sinking below. It'd be like if they say a rising tide raises all ships. Well, what if you don't have a ship, and what if your ankles are chained to the bottom of the sea and the tide is rising? That was the situation of the poor in 8th century Israel. This little wave could put you under.
So Amos could speak to us. That's what we're hoping, right?
Well, we'll see. We'll ask Frank Schaeffer if he hears anything in the book of Amos for sure.
By the way, the folks online seem to be guessing at how we fill in the blank.
Oh dear. By the way, speaking of the folks online, just to let you know, now, if you're just joining Darkwood Brew for the first time, there are a few folks online that have a little game going. That there's so many people with doctorates that come on the program that when they see the word PhD, they drink. I don't know what they're drinking, but they drink something. Frank Schaeffer, I'm sorry to inform you, does not have a PhD. However, tonight we are bestowing upon him a Darkwood Brew honorary doctorate. So
honorary doctorate. Go right ahead. We'll just say that often.
That's right.
Make up for all that. That'll be good.
That's right. Dr. Frank Schaeffer. So, but But before you start doing anything like that, we should probably get to our Pneuma text.
Yeah.
And so what we're going to do is invite you simply to, music's going to play for about 30 seconds to kind of get us warmed up, just to take a couple deep breaths, let them out slowly. And the Pneuma Divina is based on this ancient Lectio Divina pattern that has over 1,500 years proven itself to open people to authentic spiritual insight. Sometimes it comes very quickly, and sometimes it just simply opens you up for later on in the day. You're going to hear this passage that we just went through read 4 separate times with a couple of minutes or about 90 seconds placed between each reading. You'll hear instructions to how to come out that passage. So simply pay attention. The passage will be put on screen, or you can close your eyes like I like to do. But simply pay attention to the instructions, and we'll move through this in a meditative way. And when we come out of it, we'll be with Frank Schaeffer and see what insights have come for us. So let's simply prepare ourselves for Amos 2, verses 6 through 8. Now, as you hear the passage read for the first time, simply pay attention to the overall message again. We've been through some of that message, and just simply hold all that in your mind. Oftentimes, we've encouraged you during this broadcast to ask a question, to identify that question before we go into the Pneuma reading. This time, we're actually encouraging questions to come as a result of our Pneuma reading. So simply hold that passage, let it stir around in your mind as you hear it for the first time again.
Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. Father and son go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. And in the house of their God they drink wine bought with fines that they imposed.
Now, as you hear the passage again, simply pay attention to what word or phrase you are drawn to. When you identify that word or phrase, then consider every place in your life experience where you see that word or phrase engaging.
Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. Father and Son go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. And in the house of their God they drink wine bought with fines that they imposed.
As you hear the text read a third time, consider how that word or phrase you're drawn to, what questions it asks of you, your immediate community, and society as a whole.
Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. Father and Son go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. And in the house of their God they drink wine bought with fines they imposed.
During this final reading, we invite you to simply, if you're caught up in the conversation provoked by that last reading, continue that conversation. Otherwise, simply hold yourself open, perhaps saying a prayer for those who are affected by that or who have come to mind as you've heard that word or phrase.
Thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. Father and Son go into the same girl, so that my holy name is profaned. They lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. And in the house of their God they drink wine bought with fines they imposed.
Seems like sometimes those words could have been written yesterday. Well, coming up in just a moment, we'll be joined by Frank Schaeffer, and we'll be talking about modern parallels and inviting you into the conversation as well. Thanks, guys. Well, now it's my pleasure to welcome Frank Schaeffer to Darkwood Brew. Welcome back, Frank.
Hey, Eric, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you on again. You have been on Darkwood Brew as a guest a couple times, and we also just, about a month ago, did a conversation for the Center for Faith Studies here in Omaha, Nebraska, together. But assuming there might be one or two viewers out there who's not familiar with you, what's the thumbnail sketch on Frank Schaeffer?
Well, like the prophet Amos, I'm a grumpy. I'm a grumpy honorary for one night Darkwood Brew PhD. Is that what he had too?
That's right. You get an honorary doctorate for at least 6 weeks. So
that's exactly right. And I have my glass of wine here, but I did not sell the pour for this. Okay.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Great. So in your background, you've had a lot of experience from religion, kind of from going from the right to the left.
I mean, the short thumbnail is that it's really more as if I've lived a couple of different lifetimes. Unfortunately, they were not concurrent. They all kind of they've shortened the overall span probably. But I grew up in a fundamentalist missionary home in Europe in the 1950s and 60s. And then, like a lot of evangelical families, went into the family business, as it were, and became the sidekick of my father in the 70s and early 80s, having wanted to be a painter and an artist and a filmmaker, and eventually actually left the evangelical right at a high point when I was being quite successful, flying around in Jerry Falwell's borrowed jet and appearing on the 700 Club and doing all those things. And the part of the religious right I was involved with really gave birth to the anti-abortion movement, which in itself became really the bedrock of where the whole culture war that we have until the present, in its newest manifestation being the Tea Party, for instance, comes from. So I saw that arc, I got out, and I've written a number of books as a novelist, like Portofino and other things like that have been out there for a while. But then a couple of years ago, I wrote a memoir called Crazy for God. And the subtitle is How I Grew Up as One of the Elect, Helped Found the Religious Right, and Lived to Take All or Almost All of it Back. And that was a story that really spans what it's like to grow up in a fundamentalist background, but then also incorporates the history of the religious right and a personal memoir as to why I got out. And so I'm someone who's very politically sensitive, I guess, to the times we're in, because my family helped shape that moment of American history, not in a hugely major way, but definitely we played a part. And we knew people like Ronald Reagan and the Bush family and others, got them to take a stand on our, quote, issues. And I watched all that happen, was part of it, got out, and now have kind of taken a journey to the other side, as it were, politically, but spiritually have remained someone who is questioning, who is active, who can be found in my local Greek Orthodox church on Sundays, because I enjoy liturgy, and I'm part of that spiritual mix still.
Great. Well, Frank, as you encounter the text this evening, we see a lot of suggestive verses there. What strikes you about? Do you see some modern parallels in your own encounter with that text?
Yeah, it's odd, Eric. We talked the other day, and I've been thinking about this, but this week has been a strange one for me and kind of a terrible preparation for this session. All joking aside, I've been at a 4-day conference in Nashville on human trafficking. And literally, if you were going to take a biblical passage to cover this nightmare that I've been wading through, as someone whose fondest moments are spent with my little grandchildren, to be talking to people from the State Department and from the FBI and from the military and social workers and Christians who have opened their homes and survivors of trafficking who came to tell their stories. We were doing 8 sessions a day for 3 days straight. And I opened with a keynote and I closed, not being an expert, but just sort of to try to draw things together for folks. And really, the description of that passage we think of in terms of economic issues, Occupy Wall Street, the rich are getting richer. But there was an interesting study that was shared with a Baylor professor, a wonderful Korean woman, Korean-American woman, who was saying, interestingly enough, in countries like Nepal that pull a lot of trafficking, it's not from the poorest areas that the traffickers have the most success in luring particularly young women to a better life. And then, of course, they put them into prostitution, child pornography, and the rest. It's from the areas that are on the internet already and actually are prosperous enough so someone in the village has an iPad or a computer, and they are looking at the world out there and realizing how poor they are. And the lure that the traffickers use is to say, you can get some of this good stuff, just come with me. So she says, ironically, the poor who are living in the most traditional villages are the least vulnerable, even though they have nothing. It's those who have gotten a taste of a vision of what we have in America and in the West. They are vulnerable to the false promise and the lies because they suddenly realize how left out they are of the boom times we take for granted. And of course, they're sold into very direct manipulation and slavery. Literally the father and son in our culture going into the same woman. When you think about the fact that, as I learned this week, the average age that a young woman, or a young man for that matter, goes into prostitution in this country when they have their first sexual encounters for money, not that they're looking for it, but being prostituted. And this will blow your mind, but this is a real fact. The average age is age 12.
12.
So, yeah, 12. So essentially, over 80% of all people who are in the sex trafficking business and wind up being manipulated have been molested in some way, even earlier than that. But the average age for someone who's trafficked into the business is 12. And when you think of something like that, and you think that one of the biggest uses of trafficked prostitutes, who either came in trafficked, are still under 18, or started when they were 12 years old or even younger, is at places like Super Bowl. And we have these huge American parties where, hey, we all get together and have fun, and God forbid anybody brings up anything negative, because isn't this supposed to all be fun? One of the pimps who was down there, who has reformed and come out of it, and is now bearing witness against it, is saying that that's where the business was best. It was at our big American national parties, Super Bowl Sunday, and at the Super Bowl itself, or at places where people gathered, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a gloss of this country of ours where we have all this fun and we have all these material possessions. And we all know, that under there we have the poor, we have the minimum wage, we have people like the Koch brothers walking away with half the national treasure, a tiny percentage of this country owning a huge chunk of the wealth. We hear these numbers, but I'll tell you what, this week it really came home to me. Because you talk about the least of these who have nothing, whose faces are literally being ground into the dirt, literally being sold from father to son in this sort of macho culture where it's all great and people go to strip clubs. Well, that girl was in this trade when she was 12 and not by choice. And it's not a joke. There was a devastating piece shown down there, talk about the culpability of our nation, that the Pentagon sent down a woman who is in charge of trying to stop military involvement in sex trafficking. I'm talking about the American military. And it was particularly nefarious in Korea a few years ago, where our own MPs And Fox News, for once, had stole the march on everybody. This was a piece they did about 8 years ago now, which got the ball rolling to change it. They were going into the red light district to pick out the clubs that were safe enough for our guys to go to and actually patrol them while our troops were having sex with underage trafficked girls from the Slovakian countries as well as from within Korea. And so the military itself, our military, has been part of the trafficking problem. So, you know, when you peel back the happy-clappy veneer of American culture, we are right where Amos was. It's not like we're sort of there. It's not there's a connection. You know, if he was taking poetic license in his period of history, the way, say, I do as a writer once in a while by being metaphorical or describing something in an overblown sense, I'll tell you what, it's an exact description of where we're at. So I wasn't there, and I'm not an Old Testament scholar, but if you asked a poet to have walked out of this whole symposium on sex trafficking that I've been in this whole week, just that aspect of our culture, which is feeding it, billions of dollars going into this and coming out of it, I mean, those 3 verses are it. Now, that's just a tiny aspect, and it's not where your head goes first. You'd think first about economic disparity and all these other things. Well, there's no economic disparity greater than a 3-year-old being snatched off a street in Nepal and winds up in America at age 8 or 12 being trafficked to lawyers, judges, and doctors. This isn't happening off at someplace else. It's in your country club. It's right down the street here in Massachusetts. I talked to the FBI agent who's out of Orlando who's handling these cases. It's upper middle class white men that are driving the business. So just think about that. So our 1%, you know, one of their little toys that a few of them play with is children. And this isn't fantasy and it's not hyperbole. So we're this culture of ours, when it comes to grinding the poor, is literally doing the kind of thing you associate with the Bronze Age and ancient history, which is genuine enslavement of young people. And that doesn't even get into the lectures I heard on trafficking of workers. And they were giving all the signs to look for. If you're in a hotel and there's a maid cleaning your room and she looks nervous and has a bruise, and you ask her how she's doing and she doesn't dare speak to you. You meet somebody in a bar on a street corner and they've got somebody hovering near them and won't let them answer for themselves. People in doctors' offices that they come in with their own interpreter. And they don't want the hospital interpreter. And no, I'll tell you what he said, why he's got a cut on his hand or whatever. It's amazing to me, you know, they were giving signs on how to look for our most exploited people. And it isn't just sex trafficking. It's people without green cards. It's a mail order bride coming in who thought she was coming in for one thing and gets another. I was staggered by just the sheer numbers. So just that one detail of where our culture is so revealing to me and so infuriating as a father, grandfather, and human being, an American citizen, you know, as the father of a Marine who, by the way, went off to Afghanistan and fought for this country. And to think that the U.S. military has been part of this problem and that we have people who are doing things like this almost in broad daylight. And I'll give you one last detail, and I know this has turned into a bit of a rant, but I just came back from this. I got off the plane, cooked up the computer here. One of the amazing things is how the internet that we're on right here today, after this show, if people start clicking through on Facebook, you will find that, as all the people said, including the FBI agent and the State Department representatives, guess what makes this trafficking of all kinds, labor, sex, all of it, possible? It's that people like Google and Facebook aren't putting in any kind of screening. And Facebook, for instance, says if you see a problem, call them and they'll take care of it. Don't call the police or the FBI. They always say they're dealing with it. And yet you're always 3 clicks away from a trafficker or a pedophile, and it's right there. So our, quote, information highway that we are using all the time and every day is such that it is being used to do things that we're talking about in Bronze Age, pre-Christ Israel, at a chaotic moment of judgment from God as being predicted by Amos. Not only are we right back where we started, our modern technology is now the slave ship. And people don't get that. You can't find these people without using the internet highway. So there's guys sitting in Russia selling 13-year-old girls using Google, Facebook, and Backpage. And no one's doing a damn thing about it. So we are literally, not sort of metaphorically, that's the point I'm trying to make. It's not as if we're sort of there because of our tax code, something abstract. We're there so literally it makes your head spin when you talk to people who are working on exploited Mexican workers, who are working on exploited children in the sex trade. And that doesn't even cover the person down there holding 2 minimum wage jobs so they can feed their child. So, yeah, there's a lot right about America. I love my country, but I'll tell you what, when you talk to people in the FBI who are trying to get a little bit of funding for a shelter for young women that they rescue, and no one will take them in, and they can't find anywhere to put them, when you realize there's only 30 beds in the whole Houston area for young women who come out of trafficking, and there's tens of thousands of them involved in Texas alone, it's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Well,
sorry for the rant, but there you got it.
Hey, that's
Now
why
I'll have to have my drink to calm down a little bit.
that's why we had you on. We thought, who could rant as well as Amos? Without Frank Schaeffer.
And Frank's not grumpy; he's just pissed off.
That's right. That's right. No, but
And I'll just say one more thing. I'm a fairly informed person. I think I'm fairly informed. But I came out of this seminar saying, you know what? I'm just one of these idiots that doesn't want to see evil and do anything about it, because all the information I learned this week was available to me, and I never bothered to find out.
yeah.
I sort of knew it was out there, but somebody else is doing it, right? No one else is doing anything. So I'll tell you what, if I get another 10 years of life and activity, I know one issue I'm going to be working on and try to figure out how I can help some people who are helping these guys.
Yeah. Well, it's easy.
It's infuriating.
And it's easy for any of us if we're not directly engaged in overtly illegal activities like that to turn a blind eye or be oblivious to it. And then also what is particularly disturbing to me is how easily we write off people who are needing those shelters and so forth, and they get classified so easily as the looter class or the parasites on society. And it's like, do you have any idea about the backgrounds that some of these people have that have led to that?
Let me just say one thing when it comes to whether it's a Mexican gardener who's being bribed, being bullied to work long hours because somebody, or whether it's a little girl turning tricks, there's a common denominator through all of it. And that is, the big problem isn't the people who are the traffickers, it's the clients. So that if it wasn't for the upper middle class exploiting workers, if it wasn't for the upper middle class and upper classes exploiting the sex trade, we look at the people, oh, them over there. I'm sorry, it's our people. It's people who are comfortable, just like you and me are sitting here tonight. It's our class of people that are doing the buying and selling. They own the corporations that hire these folks, and they are the people who provide the low, the sex for hire business with clientele. And we've got this macho culture that thinks this is all a joke. That like, oh yeah, it's a boy thing, it's a man thing. People do this. Well, it isn't funny.
Yeah. Well, we want to actually come back to you and ask. We've been kind of focusing a lot on the overtly illegal activities. So I want to come back and ask you about how about areas in our society that are perfectly legal, perfectly above board, where we see these issues. That's where Amos has really kind of focused us this evening, and
right.
And we also want to invite our internet crowd into the discussion as well as the coffee house. So we're going to turn to the musical feature by the band, and when we come back, more with Frank Schaeffer.
Thank you. We have Mr. Robert Bobo Bennett on the drums, Ricky Williams on the bass, Ron Cooley on guitar. My name is Jorge. We were doing a tune by Chuck Moronic, and it's entitled Bless the Lord, My Soul.
Thanks, guys. Bless the Lord, my soul, part of Chuck Monick's Jazz Tizé project. So, yeah. Well, I want to go back to Frank Schaeffer and just kind of lead things off. I want to just kind of put a finer point on some of the things that go on that were in Amos's point of perspective and under his fire tonight in our passage were things that were perfectly illegal that also exploit people. And it reminded me very much of an experience I had a number of years ago in Scottsdale, Arizona. There was a woman who came into my office who was a widow, recent widow, who was on the verge of bankruptcy because for the last 2 years of her husband's illness, the medical expenses just became overwhelming. They actually had been fairly wealthy before the husband's illness, and it nearly bankrupted them. She had a whole lot of credit card debt, and she was in her 70s, upper 70s, and trying to make good on the debt. And so as part of we were working together, and she went to Walmart, actually, a large corporation that I have not just named, whose name I forget, but to apply for a job so that she could pay these be paying off these balances. And they did the interview, and then they checked her credit rating, which was, of course, horrible, and they wouldn't give her the job.
Right.
Because she had a bad credit rating.
Right.
Well, you think, well, wait a minute, here's this poor widow who's trying to make good on her debt, and she's being prevented from doing a job that would actually allow that. And yet, the people who at this large unnamed corporation, that if you just kind of step back and breathe for a second and realize, well, these are not dangerous, evil people either. You know that a big corporation that employs hundreds of thousands of workers, they probably have some statistics someplace that suggests that if you have a bad credit rating, maybe you don't show up to work as much, or maybe more people will steal from you. A fraction of a percent more will do that. But if you run that out through 100,000 or 200,000 employees, it starts to add up into dollars. And so you don't do this, because if you did this, that's money not only you've lost, but it also then makes you less competitive against the other corporations that aren't doing this. And so you just have a perfectly rational manager trying to mind the bottom line for the stockholders, for the company, and keep them competitive. Suddenly we have a widow who's trying to make good on her debt, who is going bankrupt because she can't even get a job. I think Amos would have something to say about that kind of a system. Seeing that it's not just simply evil people. Actually, the people of Israel, they were good church-going types, so to speak. They loved their country. They were all rah, and doing a lot of good in the world, and yet the system was rigged against a whole class of people.
Yeah. You waiting for me to say something, Eric?
No, jump right in, and then we're going to take a question.
You
from the
heard
internet and
tonight's
make
sermon.
copies.
I told you heard the sermon. That was it. But no, I agree with you, and I think that But the interesting thing to me is that there's a lot of things that are perfectly legal. For instance, like the internet, where impoverished people are hired at minimum wage, or you have people advertising for things that are illegal. But because of our commitment to some very good things, like free speech, we're so leery of putting a moral filter on things. I'm not talking about censorship, but in our brains of looking and saying, look, helping people is great, and then we go to war and we say we're building democracy through military might. But the impulse was to free people. If you believe somebody like George W. Bush, for instance, in his justification in Iraq after we got there for the wrong reasons, sort of turning it around and saying, no, this is a war of liberation. Well, nobody got liberated, and they're all getting killed by car bombs still, just like they were when we were there. And the same thing goes for some of the great liberal idols we worship in this country that are non-negotiable, like free speech. But, when credit ratings wind up keeping widows from getting jobs, and free speech means that we give excuses to multi-billion-dollar corporations like Facebook, for instance, to not bother to use their high-tech knowledge to try to get pedophiles and traffickers and other people off and inhibit their ability to use the technology. I mean, you better darn well believe that if they were being raided by Chinese corporations looking for their corporate secrets, Facebook would be able to find a way to stop that. And so would Google, if it was their butt on the line. But when it's just the widow or the orphan or the kid in Nepal who is being trafficked, all of a sudden they don't have the money, the time, and the technology to do this. And the problem is that we have systems set up with these high ideals: freedom of speech, access to the internet for everybody, computer on every desk, whatever it may be. But when there is no moral tension, when there is no prophetic voice, when there is no questioning to say, yeah, but wait a minute, credit ratings are fine, but there have to be exceptions because of this widow who needs a job. Let's not get geared into the system ahead of the compassion that makes the system worthwhile to begin with. That's the problem. And so I think Amos's prophetic voice, and the prophetic voice of anybody today who brings a vision to the culture we're in, is not to point fingers at the culture and say, oh, they're terrible people, they're all wicked and so forth, but to remind folks that the value of what they're doing turns out to be nothing if every time you come to a choice, whether it's to hire somebody for the corporation you didn't name, or whether it is to take another look at some of our liberal beliefs and say, well, just because right-wing Christians care about issues of trafficking doesn't mean that left-wing secularists shouldn't either. There are certain things where we can agree. And I think one of the great sad things of our own age is that the prophetic voices say on the environment, oh, that's a left-wing issue, so now all Republicans have to pretend there's not global warming. Human trafficking, oh, the evangelicals are upset about it because it's part of the sex industry. That must just be more prudish right-wingers. No, it's not. It's compassionate people you may not agree with politically or go to church with, but they're not doing this to get the next George Bush elected. They're doing this because they have a heart for people who are stuck. So I really do think, Eric, that if we're going to look at some of these prophetic issues of wealth and poverty, the environment, what we're doing in human trafficking, not just sex trafficking, all the human trafficking we do with low-wage workers who don't have green cards, et cetera, and so forth, we've got to start trying to find ways, Eric, where you and I draw on both of our backgrounds from the left and the right and find a place where we can find some issues where, to use this, in a euphemistic way, Rachel Maddow and the anchors on Fox News can sit down and agree on something, because we can't assume that, if you're compassionate for the poor and you care about that widow, that only left-wingers or liberals are going to care about that person. And we can't assume that only right-wing Christians in Dallas are going to open homes for young women who are rescued from trafficking. We've got to, you and I and this program and other people of goodwill, have to find a way to put a moral compass back on the American discourse, free from the culture war spin. And so that when it comes to global warming, let's just look at the real numbers and take the politics out of it and try to actually do something for our planet. And I think the same for the poor. So I think one of the sins that I am guilty of, and that liberals are guilty of as much as the right wing, is that we have played the culture war game to the exclusion of actually the betterment of people's lives, because we want to either capture the issue and make it ours and take the credit and win elections with it, or we won't touch it. Right. And I think poverty and wealth issues, the environment, and human trafficking are three things that have suffered horrible defeats from the culture war itself, because people try to capture them for political capital. Yeah. And instead, we've got to look at the truth of the matter. What matters isn't the big picture. It's that one little girl who just got snatched off the street, and it's that one widow who can't get a job. And we got to personalize this and depoliticize it.
Now be careful, Frank. You're going to implicate all of us in this before long.
Right.
Hey, we are running a little bit behind, but we do have some input from the coffee house and from the internet. I'm going to suggest we take both comments at the same time, and then we'll let Frank respond to that. So first, to the coffee house here, Morris has identified a question or comment.
Eric, Frank, I do have a question from Jessica.
All right.
Hello. When I was doing the Numa Novena for the first part, the message that I really got from the text was that just because something is right, in quotes, or legal, doesn't make it actually right. And so my question was, if we're going to do what everybody agrees is a good idea, which is kind of everyone needs to come together and, work for really what is right and not just what is, right in the quotation marks, where do we start with that? What sort of moral principles are we going to look to? And I would imagine the obvious answer would be the ones from the Bible, but again, you get all, there's so much interpretation that's there. I just was curious if you had any thoughts about, what that would be.
Well, I have a brief thought, but Eric might want to lead off on this.
Actually, I was going to say, before you answer that, let's also go to the internet, too, because we don't know whether there could be some crossover here. But the first question is, where do we start? And Chris...
That's a main question online. Everybody's appalled by all this stuff, and they're saying, how can we help? What do we do this? Where do we go? What networks can we use to find out if there are good networks out there that we can connect with and resource with? How do we learn to recognize prophetic voices? All those kinds of things.
Okay, I'm just hearing my ear. They couldn't hear you about the first half of your statement there, so could you maybe...
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Basically, well, you were just echoing. Basically,
I was echoing.
Where do we start?
Where do we start? What do we do?
Start?
How do we know whether the human trafficking websites that we think we want to work with to help end this, or to at least aid and support the prophetic voices that are out there, how do we know that whether they're legit places or not? I mean, if we're 3 clicks away from all that, then how do we know where to go?
Well, let me kick one thing in on a practical level. To answer that question practically and properly, since we're going to be doing a couple of Sundays of this, I'm not going to answer it now, but what I'll do is I'll get something to Eric this week of a couple of sites that came out of this conference I went to that I have confidence in, and maybe we can put those up for folks that are interested next week online right here on Darkwood Brew, and just make it a small part of the program, even if we're going to a whole nother subject, so I can do it properly and not just off the top of my head. People sincerely asking what they can do, I'd rather give them good information with an 800 number and a website, a couple of very trusted places that are good sources and reliable. So I will get that to Eric this week. And then the other, in terms of the more general question, I would just say, again, we've got to be honest and try to depoliticize these things. And so we can't be gleeful about the left capturing environmental issues and the right capturing trafficking issues and try to make them ours. We've got to be willing to sit down with people we don't agree with on anything else and say, the other stuff doesn't matter today. We're going to work on this issue together. And so Christians, especially Christians who come from an evangelical background, have to shut up about Jesus for a while and not try to use these issues to get people to accept Christ. And liberals have got to work on these issues with Christians and not get offended when they want to open their time in prayer together, and just suck it up. Because these are big deals, and if there's a woman in your community who's running a Bible study and she's the only person who cares about that Mexican guy standing on the street corner who's been trafficked without a green card, then grow up if you're a liberal or a secular or an atheist or an agnostic and you don't like Jesus talk, and work with someone who annoys you, And conversely, from our side, from a more liberal side or from a more conservative side, there's a time and place for everything. And sharing Jesus is not the time what to be doing when you're working on a national issue that matters so much that it's the very character of our nation is at stake, whether it's environmentalism, helping the poor, in a more classic sense, or human trafficking. So I just think we have to be willing to look at some of these things that's so big that we don't listen to our pride, ego, and also to our political instincts, and we lay aside some differences and actually say, okay, we can't agree on everything, but we can agree that 3-year-olds shouldn't be snatched off the street. We can't agree on everything, but we agree that some Mexican locked in a room with 15 other guys who can't escape and who's working 18-hour days for nothing because they've got them, that I don't care who you are, whether you're a right-wing fanatic or a left-wing fanatic or a socialist or Republican or a Green Tea Party guy or whatever, most Americans will get it. That's not right. So these are the things I think we need to pull together on, and if we can find some of this stuff and actually do it, we might get somewhere.
Yeah.
We have, that's just a thing that I feel very deeply about.
Amen. Well said, Frank. Well, we will have a lot more to say on these matters in future episodes, but until then, we want to thank you for joining us this evening. And you've raised a lot of questions and a lot of great conversation on the internet and also in the coffee house. We've got questions standing by, so that we'll have to wait till next week. But thank you for coming on this week.
Thanks a lot.
Surprise there. That was supposed to be a little musical transition before communion, and you did it. I was actually trying to hurry us on into communion, but that was good. That was really good. Rather than hurrying, let's just take a breath for a second here. And I want to just simply pick up on something that Frank said early on in the episode, that what is luring some of these people who are then brought into sex trafficking and human trafficking in general are people who are human beings who are seeing what looks to them like a better life, something more than they have presently, and that lures them into this horrible industry. I think that we share with those folks, those of us who are in that better life, so to speak, we share a lot of common ground in that, in the sense that part of what keeps us from looking very hard at these issues is that we ourselves are exposed to people who have far greater wealth than we do, have bigger houses, bigger cars, and so forth. We keep looking at the next step up ourselves. It's a very human issue that all of us, kind of surrounded even by amazing blessing, start to take that for granted and start to look at what we don't have versus what we do have, and we start defining ourselves by what we lack rather than by what we have, to the point where we could be surrounded by the richest gifts that have been offered materially to humanity since its very beginning, and still feel like, oh my gosh, it's such a struggle. It's such a struggle. So our minds are turning to the next thing we can get rather than those who have been left behind. But this meal here that we celebrate every week at Darkwood Brew, known as communion, reminds us what's what. Because it reminds us, as we're looking for that next step higher on the realm, where Jesus is. If a rising tide raises all ships except those whose feet are anchored to the bottom of the sea because they don't have a boat and they are locked into a system that is offering them the going rate that was good 10, 15 years ago, but not now. Jesus is with those people whose ankles are strapped to the bottom of the sea and the sea is rising. And if we're in those boats, our object is not to say, how far can we rise, but to look where Jesus is. On a night of betrayal and desertion, he took bread and broke that bread, saying, my friends, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this as often as you eat of it in remembrance of me. As often as we eat, We are to remember a broken body. We are to remember shed blood. If you have any doubt where Jesus is in the world, we'll look to those who are being left behind, who are locked in systems of oppression and injustice, without much hope, quite frankly, as the water rises around them. But this meal does offer us hope. We know that if we will follow where Jesus goes, then we can make a change for the better, both for ourselves and for the world. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. I invite you, if you have bread and wine or juice and crackers at home tonight, to join us here at the Coffee House in Omaha in keeping the feast, the bread of life, the cup of blessing. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this episode and derived some benefit from it. I know I have. And it's really easy to predict our guest for next week. It's Frank Schaeffer. Will be with us throughout this series, focusing on this obscure and rather grumpy prophet from Israel who has unusually refined wisdom in our day as well. Well, until next week, my friends, may the Spirit of the living God, made known to us most fully in Jesus Christ our Lord, go before you to show you the way, go above you to watch over you, go behind you to push you into places you may not necessarily go yourself, sometimes through the words of an 8th century prophet named Amos. Go beneath you to uphold you and uplift you, go beside you to be your strong companion, and dwell within you to remind you that you are surely not alone. You are loved. You and all people are loved beyond your wildest imagination. And may the fire of God's blessing burn brightly upon you and within you, now and always. Amen.